After finishing up high school in the summer of 2007, most of the kids we graduated with were either headed to college, the military, or otherwise had some kind of plan. But me and my little four-man friend group had absolutely nothing lined up. We had passions in life, just nothing that inspired us so much to actually do anything about it. So by the time the new school year started, we were still slacking and partying while other kids our age were actually growing up. But then, one thing that we did have in common with the other college kids was that when mid-October rolled around, we started putting out feelers to find out where the best Halloween parties would be. Eventually, I heard through a mutual friend that this one guy he knew was planning on throwing some big house party. His mom and dad were off visiting relatives over the weekend before Halloween, so even though the Saturday fell on like the 28th or whatever and it wasn't exactly Halloween, the kid had decided to throw this huge costume party that was just bound to be wild. All we had to do was secure an invite and think up a costume, then we were all set. When it came to picking out costumes, we decided on a group costume that involved us dressing up like the characters from A Clockwork Orange. I remember scurrying around in the days before trying to beg, borrow, and steal this mishmash of boots, white clothing, suspenders, canes, and bowler hats, but there was just enough of a theme there for people to actually recognize what we were aiming for. So after assembling at one of our parents' houses, we began the 30-minute walk across 2 neighborhoods in order to get to the party. We get there at maybe 9:30 p.m. and the place is just jumping, like off-the-chain crazy with what looked like 100 costumed 18 to 22-year-old kids just drinking and dancing and having a good time. The place had an amazing atmosphere and most people were pretty friendly, even though we didn't know them, but then one of the things I noticed was there was a lot of illegal substances going around. These rich kids had way more money for stuff like that than we did, so it was pretty crazy seeing so much of it in one place. But we still had our cases of beer, our cheap vodka, and some smoke, so we just enjoyed what we brought with us, and a good time was had by all. At around 1 in the morning, we found ourselves sitting in some deck chairs near this guy's pool as the rest of the party started to die down. We decided to finish up what we were drinking, then we walked back to our neighborhood with the last few cans of beer that we had. We started shuffling our way towards the backyard side gate, which led out into the driveway and was a quicker route than walking through the house and stepping over people, etc. Then right as we get to the back gate and we're about to leave, one of my buddies, we'll just call him Jason, tells us all to wait a minute because he needs to use the bathroom before we leave. He heads back into the party. We stand around waiting for a minute or two, then he reappears telling us that we're good to go. We then head out into the dark, empty streets to begin walking back towards our neighborhood, feeling bold enough to just stroll through the night drinking from open containers. Then, about 5 or 10 minutes into our walk, I remember being suddenly lit up from behind by the headlights of a car. I figured it would pass, but then I hear the car gun its engine and speed up, almost like it was coming right for us. I start thinking that it might have been a cop about to bust us for underage drinking, but then as it gets closer, I realize it isn't a cop car, and instead of identifying themselves as cops, the people just jumped out and screamed, "That's him! Get him!" and started sprinting towards us. We didn't ask any questions. All we knew is that we were suddenly in danger for some reason, so we start running as fast as we possibly can, away from the people who obviously wanted to beat the crap out of us for whatever reason. Thankfully, we seemed to know the area better than the guys chasing us, because after the 4 of us pulled some evasive maneuvers using some alleyways that ran between backyards, we suddenly found that we were alone again. With a moment to stop and catch our breath, we started discussing what the hell just happened. One of my buddies said that he'd gotten a good look at one of the guys chasing, and said that it looked like he was wearing a costume, or at least had been at some point during the night. We realized that there was a good chance our pursuers had been at the party with us, but whatever we'd done to offend them was still a complete mystery to us. Most of us, anyway. After catching our breath and making sure the coast was clear, we headed back onto the streets to try and get home again, all the while acutely aware that we were being hunted. I think we made it about 5 more minutes before headlights reappeared again, and at first the car drives at a normal speed towards us, so we figured that it's just some other person. We didn't mind if it was the cops either at that point because we tossed out our last beers when the chase began, in which case we might even be able to get the cops to help us. But then suddenly, the car starts racing towards us again, and we realized we'd been found. The first time we actually had somewhere to run, but the second time, there was no way of escape other than to hop backyard fences. We're all running at full pelt, adrenaline pumping, and I swear the fence we climbed was one I'd never be able to climb otherwise, but the fear of getting stomped on propelled me over it. Once we cleared the fence, we just kept running and running, out of the second backyard and into a wider, more open street, until I suddenly looked behind me and saw that it was clear. By this time, we're near a small strip mall, so instead of being out in the open, we run behind the strip mall where we can hide in the dark, then take the opportunity to catch our breath again. We're all really freaking out at this point. The guys chasing us obviously want us hurt, but we still have absolutely no clue what we did to deserve it. I think in the heat of the moment, we didn't really think about that particular detail too much, as there seemed to be every chance that we'd just been singled out to be beaten by some idiots that wanted to fight and had spotted us leaving. Maybe they didn't want to get kicked out of the party by starting a fight and instead decided to run us down, beat the snot out of us, then head back to the party. It sounds random, I know, but people are cruel, and it wouldn't be the first random assault to happen just because someone was feeling drunk and aggressive. We didn't figure there was an actual concrete reason why they were chasing us, or rather, a reason they might be chasing one of us in particular. Once we caught our breath, and were trying to plot a route home that wouldn't leave us too exposed for too long, my friend Jason finally speaks up. He'd been unusually quiet since we left the party, but I honestly just figured that was a combo of being out of breath and just scared. So when he says, "Guys, I messed up," we had absolutely no clue what he was referring to. And then he says, "No, you guys, you don't get it. I really messed up back there." It then clicks that Jason did something back at the party just before we left that he was the reason that we were being chased down. I didn't even know what he'd done yet, but I already wanted to punch him in the face. But when he finally owned up to what he did, my stomach started tying itself into knots. Jason gets up, reaches into his jacket, and pulls out this big plastic baggie of sandy-looking powder. I don't know if I should say exactly what I thought it was. I don't want to get any of your videos removed or whatever, but let's just say it was a very large amount of something very expensive that can make someone very, very angry if you stole it from them. I honestly don't know what Jason was thinking, and he didn't have much of an explanation for us either. He said that he was just trying to find a bathroom, walked into a room where a bunch of people were hanging out and using, and then thought that he had an opportunity to snatch some without being seen. So, he swipes the baggie off the table thinking no one is looking, then quickly walks but calmly back outside to where we're waiting for him. Thing was, someone had spotted him stealing the baggie, but instead of just rushing after him, they must have rounded up their boys to come after us in force. Realizing that Jason was the whole reason we were being pursued was probably the first real crack in our little friend circle. We'd all been tight since elementary school, and as much as we had our ups and downs over the years, that was the first time I actually realized that not only did I not really like Jason, he was a terrible friend too. We'd been chased twice by that point, and at any moment, Jason could have just given back what he'd stolen. I get doing so would have probably come with having his maybe teeth kicked in, but instead of just taking out on the chin, he'd chosen to pull all four of us into danger. What's worse, he didn't seem to be remotely sorry for it. We tried talking him into coming back to the party with us so we could return what was stolen, but he refused. I don't know if he was legit scared of getting beat up or was just playing on our fears because it felt better than admitting that he was just some greedy thief. But either way, he refused to even try and do the right thing. And this meant that Ryan, the only guy who I'm still friends with all these years later, had to step up and be the hero that we needed. Ryan says that if Jason wouldn't man up and return what he'd stolen, then he'd do it for him. But if he had to do that, he swore to make sure that the guys knew exactly who had stolen from them and was too much of a coward to face up to it. This apparently convinces Jason to do the right thing. If we didn't try to make things right, there was a very high chance that whoever he'd stolen from would just find out who we were, find out where we lived, and would come looking for us. If we returned the stuff, there was a chance that we might get away with it, especially if we showed up in force to deter any confrontation. I know that might sound overly hopeful, and it was, but that's just what we told ourselves while we walked back to the party like condemned men heading to the electric chair or something. We knew it was going to suck walking back into that party, but run away and we'd be risking a much worse alternative. We didn't even make it to the party. We were just about coming up on the street that the house was on when the process of a car zooming up beside us repeated itself. It was the same car, same dudes, and let me tell you, it was very surreal thinking that I was about to get jumped by a guy that I'm pretty sure had been dressed as SpongeBob SquarePants a few hours before. As soon as they approach, Jason just bails, and I'm not proud of it, but my instincts also told me to run. I think I actually would have just ran off if it wasn't for Ryan just standing his ground and holding up what had been stolen so the guys could see it. The guy who'd been drinking, who I'm guessing the stuff belonged to, he just stops dead in his tracks when he sees the baggie, then gives Ryan this look of pure confusion. Ryan then holds it out, takes a few steps forward, and hands the guy his stuff back, explaining that it was our stupid friend who stole it, same dude who ran when they showed up and we knew nothing about it whatsoever. The driver snatches the baggie back, then asks Ryan to tell him the name of our friend who stole from him. By that point, I was actually rooting for Ryan to just snitch on Jason for all the crap that he put us through that night. He seemed more than willing to put his friends in danger, so why should we care about what happens to him? Instead, Ryan just goes full ride or die, says he can't say the guy's name because he knows what'll happen to him. I remember thinking, don't do it, dude. Just tell him. But Ryan stands his ground and keeps refusing to tell the guy the name of our friend. The driver then passes what was stolen to one of his boys, walks back to Ryan, then starts smiling right in his face. He starts saying how Ryan had had balls for not ratting the guy out, and he'd let him walk away if he just passed a message on to him. Ryan asks what the message is, and the guy just smashes his forehead into Ryan's face so hard it straight up knocks him off his feet. The guys are just laughing as they get back in their car, and I got so frightened that they'd try to drive over Ryan while he was down that I hooked my hands under his armpits and started dragging him off the road. I guess the headbutt must have just knocked his lights out because all he did was groan and keep his hands over his nose while I dragged him. After that, the car that had been chasing us for over an hour by that point just drove off into the night and away from the party. Ryan ended up with a broken nose, and I guess that motivated him to pass the driver's message on to Jason. He didn't headbutt him, but they punched him so hard and so much that it bust his lip and gave him a nasty black eye. I didn't see the fight itself, but I heard it only started because Jason once again refused to apologize for what he'd done, and that he told Ryan that he was stupid for going back to that party in the first place. We didn't see much of Jason after that, and over the years, the other guy who was there kind of faded into the background too. But like I said earlier, me and Ryan still keep in touch because a guy who'd be willing to do the right thing and have my back like that is a friend worth keeping. Just so you know, I changed Jason's name for this. As much as I hated him for what he did that night, I'm not petty enough to try and name and shame him on a channel as big as yours. On the other hand, Ryan's name is really Ryan because guys like that deserve shouting out. So thanks, buddy. Here's to saving our butts that night. You were the hero we needed when we needed one most. Okay, so back when I was in my third year of uni, me and all my mates decided to go to this massive Halloween warehouse party as a group. For reference, we were 5 girls between the ages of 20 to 22. We all got dolled up in our various costumes, do some pre-drinking after meeting up in one of our flats. Then we get a taxi into the town center to head down to the club at about 11 at night. We get there, the music is great. Everyone looks lush, and aside from the steep drink prices, we were all having a better night. And then out of nowhere, some absolute bellend decides to ruin my night by harassing me wherever I went. I'm not one to turn down a drink or a dance if a lad is fit enough, but this wanker thought that it would be funny to act all creepy around us in a spooky clown outfit. And let me tell you something, I hate clowns. I'm serious. I'm 100% terrified of them. And I have been ever since I was a little girl. So for him to come up and think it's funny to actually scare me by making his mask stare at me was not my idea of a laugh. When I told him to F off, he kept saying, "Oh, come on, love, it's only a joke." But I wasn't in the mood for him, so I walked off to the bar and ignored him. After that, I kept noticing him looking at me from across the bar, keeping his mask on and staring at me because he knew it bothered me so much. I tried to just ignore him and focus on having a good time, but he really made it difficult and I never felt 100% safe. Later on that night, after a few more drinks, I started to need a wee, so I asked my friend to come with me to the toilets. I had to basically drag her away from the bar because she was chatting, and then just when we're outside the girls' toilets, she sees some guy that she'd fancied, so she asked me to wait a minute while I got his number. I tried to wait for her, I really did, but when I started to feel like I'd wee myself, so I just went into the toilets and found a cubicle. And this was later on at night, the last hour of the club night, so it was already emptying out and the toilets weren't that busy. I found myself a cubicle and then text my mate while I was having a wee to tell her where I was. I finish up, open the door of the cubicle, then walk out in the direction of the sinks to wash my hands, and then I see him. Clown Boy had just walked into the girls' toilets, still with his mask on, and he's making it stare at me again. There's no other girls in the toilets, and he's not laughing and trying to be funny like he was on the dance floor, and we're completely alone, and him just staring at me. He starts saying, "I was only joking, love. No need to be so uptight." And all this, but all I've got to tell him is to get out of the bloody girls' toilets, and how he's a perv for following me into them. I'm trying to act all tough and angry, but inside I'm absolutely terrified, and I'm praying that another girl comes in and joins us soon. Thankfully, I didn't have to wait that long, and soon enough these other girls walk in and start berating this horrid clown boy for being in the girls' toilets. The noise then attracts one of the bouncers who radios his mates, and before long, the clown boy is being thrown out of the club for having gone into the girls' bathroom. I was buzzing, honestly. He seemed really angry at me and acting like it was my fault for getting him kicked out, but he couldn't do anything about it because he was basically being dragged out by the bouncers. What started as quite a scary situation ended up with a brilliant ending, because now I could enjoy the last hour before closing time without worrying about getting harassed. The club night finishes, but in the chaos of what spills out of the club and into the kebab houses across the road, I managed to lose all my mates. In the end, it's just me, on my own, struggling to get a taxi, and because it's October, I'm freezing my nips off. None of the black cabs had their lights on, and the ones that did got snapped up before I could even get a word in. It started to look like I was going to have to walk home, which would take about half an hour, and since I was wearing heels and a miniskirt, there was no chance of that happening. It was either walk, stand around waiting for a taxi around sleazy lads trying to chat me up, or a third option. There was a lad I'd been dating on and off that lived in a flat quite close to the town center, a flat that was maybe only 5 minutes walk away from the club I was at. I could call him and ask him to sleep over, but the problem was that he might think it was something that it wasn't. That, and I was still into him when I honestly wasn't anymore. Point being, I was still in two minds when I actually called him, woke him up, and told him my problem. He said it was fine, that he'd get up and get me a blanket so I could sleep on his couch. Knowing I could leave the chaos outside the club felt like such a relief. Definitely not the kind of place you want to be as a girl on her own. But then, as I'm walking away, I feel a bit guilty worrying about where my mates are, so I'm calling them and texting them, trying to get a response out of any of them, but no one will reply to me. So, picture the scene. I'm drunk, wobbling in my heels, trying to get my mates and remember how to get to this guy's flat, all at the same time. It put my multitasking abilities to the test, but I just about managed it, right up until I saw someone sitting on some steps not far ahead of me. They looked quite young, about my age, and they were absolutely plastered. They were sitting on the stone steps of a building, but they were leaning up against the wall next to them, looking like they were just completely out of it. I instantly got a bit nervous about walking past them on my own, so I crossed over to the other side of the street and just tried to get past them without drawing any attention. But in my heels, with that bloody clacking, it was almost impossible just to walk past without the drunk man noticing. I knew the moment he saw me because he starts drunkenly saying, "Oi, where you going?" But it was so slurred that I thought he just sat there on the steps, slurring to himself. But then the next thing, he's shouting "Oi" even louder, and I look over my shoulder to see a lad who looked like he was half wearing a bowler suit from the waist down and who was carrying something in his hand. I couldn't work out what it was about him, but he looked oddly familiar, and it was only when he brought the thing to his hand up to his face that I realized what it was. He was carrying a mask, that same creepy clown mask that had been staring at me all night. It wasn't just some random drunk I'd been walking past. It was Clown Boy, and he was not happy to see me. I just kept walking at first, hoping that he was too drunk to follow me, but all it took was one look over my shoulder to see that he was. Granted, he was only stumbling towards me, trying to work one of his arms into his boiler suit costume thing, but he was definitely trying to follow. Again, my go-to move was to get bullshit, and I turned around to shout at him that if he came anywhere near me, I'd call the police and have him arrested. But that only seemed to make him laugh. His laugh in the club had been cringy, but now, with him being as drunk as he was, his laugh sounded all unhinged, a sound that was made even creepier when contained in the plastic clown mask that was creeping me out harder than ever. I tried walking as fast as I could in my heels, powering it towards a left turn that I knew I needed to take. I turned, acting like I was still going at walking pace, then I took off my heels and ran as fast as I could along the cold, wet pavement, hoping I could recognize where my date's flat was in the dark. I think that was the one move that saved me from something unspeakable that night, as Clown Boy didn't realize that I put some distance between us until we finally turned the corner and saw that it was running. He shouted again, but I didn't look back that time. I just kept going, keeping my eye out for the right apartment building. It felt like forever, but in the end, I spotted the right building, crossed over the road, then was almost at the buzzer when I felt it. This sharp, stabbing pain right in the center of my right foot, and I let out this really loud yelp of pain before basically hopping up the rest of the steps. I rang the guy's buzzer. He let me in, and I just about got myself through the big heavy door before I had to sit down and call him to come down and get me. As part of my black cat costume, I was wearing black tights that night, and there was blood just dripping off my heels as I was sitting down and holding my foot in the air. I didn't see it, but I knew what it was. I'd stood on some broken glass, and it had cut me really, really deep. Weirdly, it didn't hurt at all, and even though there were loads of blood and I knew it was a deep cut, I think the adrenaline just kept me going, that and knowing that I was actually safe. The guy ended up driving me to A&E at about 4:30 in the morning, and we had to wait in a waiting room that was almost entirely made up of other people in costumes who'd hurt themselves while drunk. The guy I'd been dating on and off stayed with me the whole time, even held my hand when it was my turn to be examined. I thought that I might just get away with stitches, but I ended up having to stay in A&E for hours because the doctors wanted to make sure that there was no leftover glass in my foot. Thankfully, there wasn't. The doctor had got it all out on the first exam, but then I needed to get my foot stitched up, so that was more hanging around and waiting for something that was really, really unpleasant. Finally, after about 3 hours of sitting around and getting treatment, I was free to leave. The doctor told me to stay off my foot for at least a fortnight, but other than that, I was okay. I ended up going back to Leeds to stay with my parents while I was healing up, but the whole time I've been texting Joe, the guy who'd given me the lift and had been so nice during such a horrible time. We agreed to go on another date when I got back, as I thought giving him a second chance after all that was the least I could do. And I think that's where our relationship really started. When I realized how supportive and loving he could be during a crisis, I'd been incredibly indecisive about any potential relationship with him, but That sealed it, and we've been dating for coming up on 8 years now. A bit of a weird origin story for a relationship, I know, but it makes total sense in my head. That run-in with Clown Boy was without a doubt the most unsettling and frightening thing that had happened to me during my university years. Probably the one time I ever truly felt unsafe in Sheffield town center. I'm still eternally grateful to Joe for everything he did for me that night, and I'm hoping he'll keep me feeling safe for many years to come. I went to a Halloween party in my early 20s that went really wrong really fast. The host was a mate of a friend's brother, and he seemed like a really nice lad at first. Didn't seem to mind his flat getting a bit messy for the sake of a party, and otherwise seemed like a really chill guy. But as the party went on and things started to get a bit madder, you can tell the guy was starting to get a bit stressed out. He asked people to only smoke on the balcony, but they were wandering indoors with lit cigarettes. He asked people not to make a mess of the food he laid out, but it was trash before midnight. He asked people not to use his bedroom to get frisky, but again, that request was ignored. And by the time we got our first noise complaint, you could tell that he really was at the end of his tether. The final straw was this guy puking up in his sink, like really chunky stuff too that clogged up the plug hole. I watched the whole thing happen. The guy started puking, the host heard the sound of it, so he went running. Then when he found the guy vomiting in his sink and not the toilet, he gave him this kind of half-hearted shove. The guy was so drunk that he actually turned at the host with this annoying look on his face, but then another wave of puke came up. Only, instead of turning back to the sink, the drunk guy puked up all over the host. It was like this proper record scratch moment. Everyone went quiet, no one dared laugh, and the host just walked off to the flat's bathroom and to change his clothes. It was absolutely disgusting, and the guy who'd puked was so drunk that he didn't even really seem to know what he'd done. He just stared off into space, then down in his puke, then went back to the sink to carry on retching. A few people got up to try and take charge of the situation, going to see if the host was okay while telling the drunk guy that he needed to leave, but the whole time I'm watching, I can just feel the mood of the party shift. Then the next thing you know, the host has reappeared in the kitchenette thing, soaking wet with no top on. "Clean it up, then get out of my flat," he screams. And again, it's this record scratch moment of everyone going quiet as the host storms off again, presumably to get dressed. People were looking around at each other like, yeah, it's time to leave, as the mood went from uncomfortable to people feeling like an actual fight was about to kick off. To his credit, the drunk guy was apologizing and offering to clean up his puke at this point, but he had people telling him that it was best that he just leave as soon as possible, because it seemed like the host was going to deck him. I think the drunk guy was just too wasted to understand how much trouble he was actually in, and he just kept stalling for time because no one wanted to physically lay hands on him. But then right as the drunk guy seems to be agreeing to leave, the host reappears wearing what looked like one black glove on one of his hands, then punches the drunk guy right in the face. I didn't find out until later that it was a knuckle glove, which is basically brass knuckles but concealed in a glove. And that's why the punch made the drunk guy go flying back, and why a massive gash on his face started bleeding soon after he fell. It all happened so fast that by the time anyone realized what was happening, the damage was done. And even though some of the other partygoers managed to restrain the furious host before he could get a second shot in, it didn't matter. The drunk guy was out cold with a serious facial injury. People just freaked out. We later found out that his wound wasn't that bad, but at the time, the floppy way that he fell back onto the floor combined with all the blood, it made people think that his injuries were much more serious than they were, me included. I'll hold my hands up. I thought the guy might have been dead at first, especially after the way his head smashed into the tiling. I'd like to be able to say that I did the right thing, that I dialed 999 and stuck around to tell people what I'd seen, but let's just say me and my mates had something on us that police frown upon, so we didn't fancy rolling the dice on the whole upstanding citizen thing. Besides, we knew other people had already called an ambulance for the drunk guy, which probably meant the police were going to turn up, in which case, that was our cue to skedaddle. I wouldn't say I was scared in the moment. We hadn't done anything wrong, and we got along well with the host as we talked and smoked with him, so I wasn't scared he'd turn on us or anything. But it's just scary to me how house parties involving alcohol can be such powder kegs like that. Not to take away from the host's share of the blame, but it was like a slow-moving car crash. You watch this bloke winding up like a spring as people just kept trashing his flat all night, then eventually he just snapped. I wouldn't have reacted by hitting someone, but I can't understand why he was so stressed out. The drunk guy needed stitches for his gash, and I heard that he also got a pretty nasty concussion from hitting his head off the floor when he fell. He ended up pressing charges against the guy who hit him though, and that was an ongoing thing for a while. I'm not sure how it ended, but hopefully with the host getting anger management classes or something. I get why he was so stressed, but to try and do someone serious damage like that, it's truly frightening behavior. Click the join button to become a member today for exclusive content. Back in 2014, when I was in my senior year of high school, my mom joined my dad on a business trip over to Chicago for the weekend, which meant that I'd be home alone for Halloween night. I asked them super nicely if I could have a very small party, emphasis on very small, where I could have some friends over so we could dress up and watch horror movies. They told me I could have a very, emphasis on very small gathering, and that if anything got damaged or broken, I'd be grounded till New Year. Seconds after promising them that it'd be nothing more than a sleepover, I start organizing a full-on house party. But to save on it getting out of hand, I enlisted my boyfriend to help out. He and his friends would basically act as security and ensure the party didn't get out of hand or receive any unwanted guests, and we pay them in wine coolers or any beer me and my girlfriends could get our hands on. They agreed. Then, in as secret a way as we could manage, we started planning the Halloween party. It was almost a total success. There were no gate crashers, no one puked anywhere they shouldn't have, and for the most part, everyone had a great night. The only stressful thing at the time was that way more people showed up than I first expected. Over the 2 weeks or so that we'd been planning it, various friends had been asking me, "Oh, can so-and-so come to the party?" And I'd say yes, not wanting to be mean. I guess I did that so many times that I just lost track of the number of people who'd show up, and as much as there wasn't any permanent damage, there was definitely quite a mess afterwards in terms of empty containers and leftover food. The place looked a real mess when me and my friends woke up the next morning, and we all felt so sick from eating and drinking so much that we were in no mood to clean up for quite a while. Then finally, after heating up some leftover pizza and finishing off my boyfriend's Red Bulls, we felt ready to face the cleanup. A few hours later, everything looks as good as new. We've been real thorough too, walking the lawn over for any cigarette butts, making sure all the trash was out and the kitchen didn't smell like beer, and everything is fresh and clean again. There was just one place that I hadn't realized to check, and that was the ensuite bathroom in my parents' room. I was maybe 90 to 95% sure that it'd be fine, as everyone seemed pretty respectful of the places that were off limits. But then when I opened up the door and looked into the bathtub, I literally recoiled with horror and walked right out of the room. One of my friends starts asking me, "Oh God, did someone puke in your parents' bathroom?" I just told her to go look, and when she did, she started yelling for everyone else to come look. There in the bathroom, with God knows how much having already gone down the drain, was all this dark red, sticky-looking fluid that looked a lot like clotted blood. One of my friend's buddies made a piggish comment about one of us having our time of the month, and I had to hold back from slapping him as I explained that's not what it looked like. The guys checked the bathroom out too, and after seeing it himself, my boyfriend was the person who suggested that we call the cops. The whole thing was just so weird and creepy though, we couldn't work out who had been hurt. We were calling around to the people who'd shown up that night to ask if anyone had been hurt, but everyone said they were fine and what a great party it was. We also hadn't found any blood anywhere else in the house while we were cleaning up, and it was one of the guys who said that there's no way someone would be that injured to not leave blood anywhere else in the house. And that's when someone raised the idea of the whole thing being a prank. The cops were on the way when someone said it, and there was a moment when I felt like maybe we just overreacted a little. We didn't know if the blood was human. We didn't know if it was actually even blood. It just looked a hell of a lot like it, the way it was all dark and kind of thick. Either way, it was better to be safe than sorry, and to just get the cops involved so we didn't look guilty if anything really bad had happened. The cops immediately called for backup so they could search for clues and take samples or whatever, and there's guys in white plastic suits coming in and out of my house all day as we're feeling anxious and hungover. The whole thing was horrible. And to make things worse, my mom and dad were so worried when I told them that they canceled their business trip and came back home right away. I just felt like everything had been going great, and suddenly it was like a straight-up disaster. And I remember having this horrible, guilty feeling that someone might have actually been hurt and no one helped them. It was my party, my house. I should have helped them. You can probably guess from how horrible I feel that blood came back as being human, but there was no DNA match to tell who it belonged to. The cops made us give them the names of everyone who was at the party, which turned out to be almost 70 people. Then they went about the long, slow process of interviewing everyone who was there to try to work out who'd been hurt, as well as who hurt them. But then every single person at the party told the cops the same thing they told me and my girlfriends when we'd asked. They were fine. They hadn't seen anyone get hurt, and they hadn't heard about anyone getting hurt either, not until the cops came calling. We were only allowed to clean the ensuite bathroom at the beginning of the following week, when the cops said that they were finally done analyzing the room for DNA and all that stuff. Until then, me and my parents stayed in a hotel downtown and stayed in touch with everyone via phone. When the cops said that we could finally go home, we thought the whole thing was over for the most part. But the truth was, it was only the beginning. The rumors came first, people saying someone had been murdered at my party, and making up dumb theories on which one of us would get away with murder. It was really hurtful, not gonna lie, but since the cops seemed to have our back at first, we didn't worry about any false accusations or anything. But then came the day when the cops showed up at our house with a search warrant. I don't know if they paid attention to the rumors or if the whole thing was just like part of their procedure, but when they showed my dad the warrant and asked if they could search the house, he couldn't exactly say no. That marked a whole shift in the atmosphere though, thinking that we as a family were now somehow suspected of hiding evidence or worse. I totally get that telling the cops that we cleaned up the next day made us look a little guilty, but since we didn't have anything to hide, we didn't have anything to worry about. That doesn't mean it didn't feel awful though, having the cops search all of our stuff like we were criminals, but like I said, we didn't have anything to hide and they didn't find anything, so that was that. After the search, the cops left us alone for a while, but eventually called to tell us that we'd be kept updated with how the investigation was progressing, which I'm guessing meant they trusted us all to be innocent again. We expected to hear about a body being found in the area, one whose DNA matched up to what had been found in our tub, but we heard nothing. My parents had to actually get in touch with the cops to be told that the investigation was steadily progressing and that they'd be contacted if the detectives needed help. My dad said that he could tell the case had stalled. The cops didn't have a body, they didn't have the victim's ID. There's no DNA in the bathroom except for the mystery person, my mom and my dad, but my parents were ruled out as suspects because of their Chicago trip. They had nothing to go on, nothing at all. And until some new information came and changed the situation, the whole thing was just going to remain a mystery. There's been times in the years since where I feel like my mom and dad think I've been lying to them. The rawest moment was when the subject came up in conversation with my mom. She struggled to find the words to say it, but she basically told me that if something bad had happened and I was doing something to protect someone from going to jail, that the best thing I could do for myself was just to come out and tell the truth. I can see where she was coming from. It wouldn't make any sense to me either, and I had to swear to her from my heart that I had no idea whose blood it was, that I hadn't lied, and that I wasn't covering for anyone. She didn't ask me anything like that again, and as much as I think she wants to and mostly does believe me, I know there's a little seed of doubt in there that tells her I know more than I'm admitting. I just hope that one day we actually find out the truth of how that blood got there. In fact, I'm quite confident that at some point in the years to come, The owner of the blood will be identified after the cops somehow match the samples with something new that comes in. I just hope we find out that it was all just an accident someone had survived, and not that someone was murdered in my house while we were all partying downstairs. I don't know who that person is, who hurt them, or why they ended up in my parents' bathroom that night, but if they really were murdered, I feel like that makes it all my fault. But even worse is this feeling of waiting. I'm so sick of waiting, and I truly must know. Calling this the worst party I ever went to seems kind of reductive because what I'm about to tell you constitutes one of the worst events of my life. It was a Halloween party that I went to with my girlfriend back when we first moved to Boise. I was working from my laptop at home while she got a job down at this live music bar, and this meant that she was making new friends and socializing while I was cooped up indoors. When Halloween comes around, she asked me if I wanted to come to a party with her, one hosted by a friend that she'd met through work. I said sure, that it would be cool to try and make some guy friends to watch football with. So the night rolls round and I join her at the party. The weather that night was absolutely awful, just rain on top of rain, and the guy whose party it was had a whole BBQ setup planned which was ruined by the weather. We ended up having to grill up some hot dogs indoors, and the whole problem-solving bonding process of shifting the operation indoors was a great little icebreaker for me. So, the kitchen has a back door to which leads onto the backyard, and the guy whose home it was asked any smokers to head out back to where he'd set up a kind of smoking area. Those that wanted to crush butts had to head out back and face being soaked, but one or two didn't seem to mind. So as I'm plating hot dogs for people, I ask if anyone wants one. Some guy out back smoking a cigarette says he wants one, so I meet him at the doorway, hand him a hot dog, then he runs back under the little umbrella that constituted the party's covered smoking area. I then go handing out hot dogs, grab myself a beer, then get talking to people. I'm not even sure how long later, but one of the smokers comes running in from the backyard smoking area, yelling at people to call 911. The guy who I'd given a hot dog to had choked on it in the backyard. By the time he realized he was actually choking and needed help, he only had time to walk halfway across the lawn before he collapsed. Then, with a whole crew of people partying inside just meters away from him, he suffocated right there in the mud. I know it wasn't my fault, but knowing that he choked on the hot dog that I gave him just really messed me up for a while. It was just a really, really bad night from there on, and everyone was traumatized, and I feel absolutely heartbroken for the guy's family. I once went to a Halloween party where about 15 or so of my coworkers piled into a pretty small condo, maybe 1,200 square feet. Most of us got along and were pretty friendly with each other, but once the drinks really started to flow, things started getting kind of dicey. At one point, one of the girls finds out that the guy who owns the condo has some leftover mac and cheese in the fridge. She acts like this is the most exciting news ever and starts suggesting that we make mac and cheese bites. In all fairness, deep-fried mac and cheese is incredible when you're drunk, but I wasn't sure trying to make them while drunk was the best idea. The girl goes off, insists she knows what she's doing, and says that she's going to be a hero and return with mac and cheese bites for everyone. I actually went into the little kitchen area to grab another beer at one point, and our new chef seemed to be doing okay. She was dipping little chunks of cold mac into some flour and had a small pat of deep-frying oil heated up on the stove. I was starting to think that we were actually in for a treat, but then minutes later, I hear the most horrific, blood-curdling scream I've ever heard in my life. The girl had managed to spill the hot oil down her leg, and it was so hot that it actually fused her leggings with her skin. Don't mess with hot oil when you're drunk, people. Stick to takeout, because I swear to God, for as long as I live, I'll never forget that smell. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Wednesday and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/letsreadofficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about all the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember to crack on and crush buds.